Hello and welcome to RPG Tips again, and actually welcome to probably the video that I'm the happiest about doing in the whole 2 years. Yeah, I think it's 2 years of the channel. I'm interviewing Tana Pigeon. Well, I mean, if you don't know who she is, you should really go back to all of my videos because I think I've done like around 10 videos on all of her creations. But she's the creator of the Mythic Game Master Emulator. Well, apart from Mythic Variations, the Crafter series, the decks, and now the Mythic magazine, which is something that I will also touch later. And the closest thing to a personal hero of mine in the world of solo role playing. So welcome, Tana.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here.
For the sake of the viewers and for your sake, Tana, yesterday when I was reviewing all of the interviews that you've done, I was writing down all of the questions and the typical things that people ask you, and I'm going to try to avoid those mostly. But I'm not going to avoid the first one, which is the most typical one. Tell us the elevator pitch of who are you? Who's the person behind the Mythic Game Master Emulator?
Well, I'm Tana Pigeon, and I primarily a graphic designer and writer, but I've been a role player since I was a child. Introduction to Dungeons and Dragons, of course, like a lot of people my age. The red box when I ran across it in a bookstore. In a nutshell, that's who I am. I've been role playing my whole life, and I would say that role playing changed my life. I encountered it at a formative age. I was around 9 or 10, and I was really into fantasy books and things, and it just blew my mind. It was like this role playing felt like a living book, stepping into a book, and that really altered. It really shaped the rest of my life. So here I am today, making games, designing stuff. Fortunately, that kind of gears all my skill sets toward being able to publish and produce books that I want, and that's what I do.
Great. We're going to get right down into interesting things. I'm not going to skirt around with, oh, tell me about when you started role playing, because we're here to talk about Mythic and solo role playing.
Sounds good.
To give an idea, I've divided it in actually those two sections. First, we're going to talk about Mythic itself, and then we'll go a bit deeper in the rabbit hole about solo role playing and theory and design. So this question comes actually from the Discord. I was writing on the self-promotion channel of the Discord saying, hey, I'm going to interview Tana. What questions do you want me to ask her? And if I recall correctly, it was John who said, what are your favorite rule sets to combine with Mythic? Because that's something that we always talk about.
Right, you see that discussion a lot. It's an interesting question because Mythic can be used with any game, obviously, but not every game is the same. And I think the big question when you approach a game is how complicated is it? Because as a solo player, you're doing everything, right? So some games are more daunting than others. For my favorites, though, I had to say, this sounds like a terrible answer, but I don't have a favorite. It really depends on my mood. Like if I am just not feeling like working it very hard, I will play something simple like the old Marvel TSR Marvel game, for instance. Mm-hmm. Wonderful game. We're going way back, right? Very simple, very easy to understand, very easy to solo. So that's one of my favorites. But then when I want something crunchier, something like Call of Cthulhu is one of my favorites. Lots of crunchy bits in there. Palladium games. I like Palladium games for the unabashedly old school flavor of them and how it's so easy to manipulate. So that game is kind of a mess, but that mess is a positive thing in that it encourages you to. The rules in that aren't really like sort of set in stone, which makes it a good game to solo because you don't feel so bad winging it because the game is kind of meant to be broken. And so I would say those are probably some of my favorite ones. But then I have a whole bookshelf full. I'll play D&D right now. What am I doing? I've got I just finished a Call of Cthulhu campaign. Call of Cthulhu is probably my number one go-to game. It's just fun. So yeah, I mean that's kind of a scattershot answer to that question. But it is a hard question to answer because I've played just about everything.
Indeed. And actually, I think that was easy compared to the next one. This one's mine. Do you feel that there are specific mechanics that do go well with Mythic? And I'll give you an example because it may be a bit broad. I don't know if you're familiar with Fate, but in Fate, there's a mechanic called aspects, which establishes truths about either some character or the environment or even the game. And I feel that those translate very well to things that you can leverage with Mythic. And in fact, I've talked about this in the themes, and it could be used also in your Mythic Magazine Volume 1, Meaningful Events, substitution for the ambiguous event. You could plug directly aspect from Fate there. So have you ever had in your games a moment in which you felt that combination between the rules of the game itself and Mythic, saying, wow, this goes perfectly together, and it wasn't intended for that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, pulling up Fate is a good example. I think games that take a sort of narrative approach, or I want to say almost like a meta approach, where they have rules in it that aren't just addressing the simulation aspect, but addressing the narrative aspect. I think those interface well with Mythic because that's ultimately what Mythic itself is doing. So yeah, I would agree with you on that. It doesn't necessarily, I think, make it easier to use. It just makes it a different experience where the two mesh together better. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of good narrative games out there where that's a factor. I do think they fit together very well.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we're also going to touch on the narrativeness of your game versus the simulation. Well, we'll touch on that because I think it's very interesting, especially for solo role playing, because we are not players and we are not GMs either.
Yeah, I know you're going to get to that in a moment, but I do agree that like when I look at solo play, I think there's basically two modes to go into. There's what I call theatrical and simulation. So I think basically what you're talking about is that it's almost two completely different ways to play.
I didn't think about that, but you're completely right, and it's something that you touch on in your writing, that clear presentation of the two modes, and I think that's probably the equivalent of the more simulationist or story focused RPGs.
Right.
So it's nice two levels of two levels in two different layers things. That's interesting. We'll touch on that later, indeed. Another question from the Discord before I forget. I think this came from Marashar. I'm really sorry if I'm butchering your name. How did the words for the Oracle lists and in general all of the lists that you do, how do they get chosen? I know that you've mentioned previously in some other interviews that the first iterations came from the interpretations from tarot cards, but I don't know if that has changed or not, or if it's still your main inspiration.
Well, it was the main inspiration for the original list. As you mentioned, I have done some more lists since then. I do have an approach to it, and I think it's very important. I mean, the lists are very important because it gives a lot of the tone and the flavor to what's going to happen in the game. And I'm very conscious of when I make a list like that, I don't want it to come directly out of my brain because I don't want it to be a copy of like my thoughts and how I play. I think it's important that it's very general. That's why I started with the original list was based off the tarot because I figured the tarot has already figured this out and has like tried to hit the broadest base of human experience. Now, of course, it's old and dated, and I made some updates and such, and I didn't use it on a one-to-one basis, but I thought it helped give the lists a nice, well-rounded basis. when I'm making a new list, I try and do something similar where I will look at other media. I might, like if I'm making a list for, like this latest one for Location Crafter and for describing locations and things, I would try to look at other sources. And I don't want to be too specific in a list where it doesn't give you enough room for interpretation, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm kind of hemming and hawing a lot on this, but it's when I'm putting together one of those lists, it takes time because I will think about every single word and rehash over them. And yeah, it's basically, I don't know if that answers the question, if that makes sense.
Kind of. A lot of time and dedication.
Yeah, it's just, I think the number one important thing is that it doesn't come directly out of my brain. It's I don't want my own expectations to guide it too much in a certain direction. I mean, I have my favorite genres and I have my things that I like, and you don't want that coming through on a list that's supposed to be applicable to every genre.
And I think that's interestingly ironic because I think that the main value for me for that these random tables give me is indeed taking me out of what my brain would naturally produce. So it's
Exactly.
ironic that when producing those lists, you also force yourself to get out of your brain.
Right. Because you're looking at 100 words and it all looks very general, but then when you start using it over time, if there is a flavor in there, if there is kind of a bent, that will start coming through. And you don't want that. You want it to be as broad as possible so that it can go in any direction.
I think that's brilliant. I really didn't think about how the bias of the creator could decrease the general applicability of the table, but it's brilliant now that I think about it, that you're forcing yourself to remove your bias as much as possible to make the table as general as possible. And that's very good.
Yeah, and it's not just my opinion either. I mean, I used Mythic for years before I ever published it, and I had other lists, and the early lists I did find they did come, some of them were kind of directly out of my brain and they were biased. I did discover the bias as I was playing them. So yeah, it's something you wouldn't know just by reading through a list, but when you actually start using it and playing it, and it kind of comes alive, then you notice.
And I think when we look at very good and elegant pieces of like art or creation or random tables even, we tend to confuse simplicity with a lack of work or being easy to do, whereas it is actually the opposite. Things that work and are simple, they need a lot of work and dedication.
Right, I agree completely.
And I think I've just discovered that with the tables that you do. That's very interesting, really. Okay, let's continue with another question from the Discord. Somebody wanted to know is there likely to be a Mythic GME compendium combining the different tool sets and all the magazines, and I'm also interested in this one. If so, will there be a leather-bound premium version?
Ooh, leather bound. Okay, so yes, on the first one, I'm working on that now. It's called Mythic Complete. So yeah, it's a collection of, it's basically a repackaging of the core Mythic, which is the Mythic role-playing, Mythic Emulator, Mythic Variations, and now that the magazine is out, I'll be including some of that content, and there'll be a little bit of new stuff too. So I'm not calling it Mythic Second Edition because it's not a revamp of the system, but it is a compendium. And my main reason for doing it is that the original Mythic books looked so dated, and frankly, I never did really like how they look. That I feel like the Mythic deserves a better looking book to live in. So that's primarily why I'm doing it, but it is going to be a compendium. I do want it to be the best looking version of Mythic possible. I have my artist working on the art. Everything's going to be full color. I plan to have a hardcover edition. I had not thought about a leather version. Now,
I'd buy it.
now I am.
I promised that I would buy it.
I'm not even sure how to go about doing that, but yeah, because I really was thinking of this as the prestige version of Mythic. Definitely hardback, although soft cover. And I wanted it to be affordable too for those who don't want to go all the way on the expensive end of it. But yeah, that's well underway. I've got a cover made for it. I've got the content coming together. The artist is about a third of the way through the art, so
Yeah,
yes.
and in fact, if people want to follow the development of Mythic Complete, you post periodic updates on your Patreon.
Right. Yeah, and I would give you an expected publishing date, but I'm so bad about blowing through deadline. I think I originally said at one point May of this year. That's not going to happen, but I'm hoping it'll be this year.
That's cool. And I know you said that Mythic Complete won't be a second version of Mythic or a Mythic Next or whatever. But another person, and this is the last question from the community, I think, asked, when are we going to see a Kickstarter for a new edition of Mythic for the GME?
Yeah, people ask me about Kickstarter sometimes, and I think about it. My big stumbling block with that is Kickstarter is a lot of work. It's there's a lot involved with doing a good Kickstarter. I wouldn't want it to be, oh gosh, yeah. I was going to do Kickstarter. I would want to do all the bells and whistles, basically. So that is this pure time element issue. And the other problem with that is I'm doing fine producing them on my own the way I'm doing them now. So I don't know. To be honest, I don't even know if I like fully understand what Kickstarter would bring to this. I have done a few. I've contributed to some Kickstarter, so I'm like aware of it. But if someone could convince me, like the benefits of it, there's a part of me that actually really wants to do it just to see what happens. But it is a lot of work, and at this point, I have Mythic Complete coming out. I don't know if I'm ever going to do a Mythic second edition because, well, I don't want to say never. So this is another disjointed answer, but I have been asked about it quite a bit. It's always in the back of my mind about doing a Kickstarter, and I think if all the stars aligned, then I think it would happen.
And that's
well. Let me ask you.
Yeah, of course. Tell me.
What would be the benefit of doing Kickstarter? Like, convince me.
I'm not that familiar with Kickstarters. I mean, I've backed an awful lot of Kickstarters. I won't say the number because I would feel ashamed. I think possibly most people say it because it's the default way for a lot of creators right now, possibly to get the funds for the art and sometimes the layout and the printing and stuff like that. You don't have to basically put all the cash in advance before actually selling the product.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. The thing is that I do my own graphic design. I do my own writing. I have an artist whom I really like. I have a good working relationship with him. I have no problem paying him. I have distribution through drive-through and Amazon. So I could see someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of those components. But then again, I look at really good Kickstarters, and I'm just so impressed. They look so professional, and they're exciting and just they're flat out very interesting. I think we'll look into that. And just to kind of acknowledge that my own ignorance of this kind of thing, I think this is something I'm going to open up on my online avenues, just start getting some feedback and kind of exploring the concept.
Mm-hmm. Great. And actually, talking about the next edition of Mythic, it's the perfect segue for my next section of the interview, which is solo role playing in general. Right. Because the first question that I had was, what do you think is missing right now in the solo sphere of role playing? And to give you a context about what do I mean with this question. some years ago, I recall that we had this conversation in the Yahoo mailing list that ended up with the writing of the Adventure Crafter, because some people were saying, me included, just getting that first scene is hard. So that produced the Adventure Crafter. Most recently, it has happened with the randomized location crafter. People were saying, well, I don't want to fill the lists beforehand, I just want to play. And that ended up with the new location crafter. And to give you an idea, I felt, for instance, that initial random conditions for conflicts meaning combat or social conflicts, and random environments like the mechanical hooks for environment conditions to have an effect in your combat or situation. I felt that generators for that are missing, and in fact, I'm writing my own for now, but they are extremely crappy. But that's the only thing that I've identified until now based on my games. Do you feel that, based on your games and your experience, there's something else missing in the solo sphere?
That's a good question, and it's kind of hard to answer because there is so much going on now with solo gaming. You're seeing it all over the place, and you're seeing new iterations of it and new ideas coming out. Your idea of basically what you're thinking of as starters, like as you said, we discussed how do you start the adventure, what's the first scene, how do you start a combat, how do you start a social interaction. A lot of this stuff is starter material. Once the ball is rolling, that's not so much of a problem. But there are a lot of instances in a solo game where just getting it started, where to get started, is a problem. This is an instance where we're getting to the point where we're kind of drilling down now into more detail. The top level of how to solo role play has been established, and I think we've gone a few layers down over the years. Now we're getting into some really nitty-gritty stuff. I think that that is probably the next areas to explore, and there's a lot to explore there. This is where we get into having a lot more tools and kind of things where you can pick and choose. Like, to me, everything can be handled with a top level oracle, everything. But that doesn't mean that that's a satisfying way to do it, right? You don't need a system to determine a character's behavior. You can do that purely with oracles. But maybe you want a system for behavior, or want something like the Adventure Crafter for coming up with scenes. So I think drilling down deeper and deeper into more specific tools to handle more specific problems, I think that's where we're heading.
I completely agree. Let's go for an easier one, because this was a bit deep. Do you prefer crunchy or light systems in general? I know that you've said it depends, but overall, do you gravitate to crunch or to light systems?
I like medium crunch. Light systems, I like enough crunch where I feel like I'm playing a game, and I adore random tables. I mean, I'm so old school, and I just love it. It just got random tables. I love it. If it gets to a level of crunch where it's maybe a little too fiddly, then it starts to lose me a little bit. So I'd say I'm right there in the middle ground.
Yeah, which
and
I think
do play when I do play a very crunchy game, a lot of the times I'll remove a good bit of it. I'll just not use maybe half of it, kind of reducing it back to a low crunch game.
I think actually Call of Cthulhu may be in that spectrum of middle crunch, possibly.
I would agree. I mean, it has a lot of details, but it doesn't have a lot of rules. It's at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple game.
Okay, let's go deep again.
Okay.
How important for you is having, when you're solo role playing, the sense of player agency, the feeling of being immersed in a world versus just telling a story?
Yeah, that is everything to me. That's what it's all about. If I don't feel immersed in it, then what's the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, if you think about it, that's really the goal of all story media. I mean, whether it's movies or books, even in ones where you have no control, where you're a passive watcher, is being drawn into it. So with a solo experience, to me, yeah, it's all about being in there. I always think of it as a virtual reality. I mean, I've always thought of role-playing games as just rule sets for virtual reality. And you insert yourself in there, and those rules are now the physics of your world. It's the same with solo, and it's that's why it's so important for the solo mechanics to be there to guide you, but not be in a way to trip you. We all remember our best solo gaming experiences. You might have played a game 5 years ago that still stands out in your mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all have that. I mean, we have the games that didn't work out so well and we forget about them, but then we have the ones that really work out well. And if you think about it, a lot of times those feel like a really intense dream, like maybe a lucid dream you once had that you never forgot. The best solo role-playing experiences feel exactly the same way. And the reason for that is that you are so immersed, you are so deeply into it. And since it's just you making it, you're like deep into your head when you're in that space. And the experience becomes so intense that it almost becomes like a life experience that you remember. I think this is something that's achievable in solo play beyond what can be achieved in standard role play, or even some of the, like what I mentioned, like with books and movies and such. There's something unique about solo role playing that can take you to a very deep place, and that where it becomes a very personal experience.
In fact, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you later was if you had actually felt like real emotions when you were playing, if you had been overwhelmed by any kind of emotion when you were playing.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I've had solo games where I've had to step away. You know, like this is, I'm so invested and I understand this character so much, and the experience is so intense where I'll put it down and I might not come back to it for a couple of days, you know, while I'm kind of processing what happened. And to me, that is part of the joy of this, because I don't have to finish it in a single sitting. I could just get up and walk away, go on with my life. I'm thinking about it though in the back of my head. I'm going to bed at night thinking about it. I'm taking my shower in the morning thinking about it. And that kind of processing to me is actually part of the experience. And then when I'm ready, I'll sit down again and resume.
Do you feel that when we are playing solo, the kind of stories that we can tell and that we end up telling are different than the, let's say, social role-playing games usually tell?
Yeah, I mean, how could it not be different, right? It's just you. And again, we're talking about solo player, not GM lists and social. It's just you with your own thoughts and your own goals and what you want to achieve. You can take the game in places that maybe you never would have dared done with someone else, or you can explore some themes that are so personal to you that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. And you know, it doesn't always have to be something intense too. Like I've had some of my favorite solo experiences have been like these kind of sandbox games where I've maybe created a little town and created a simple character and plot that character in there. And that character just goes about their daily life. And that's it. And I might take them through years and years of that daily life. Nothing, no apocalypses, no zombies, no magic. And those have been very satisfying too, you know, in their own way. And that's not something you can do in social play, because I mean, how are you going to get that many people who are on the same wavelength as you to that level?
Definitely. I agree completely. I think those two dimensions, indeed. You've already covered the themes and the niche likes or niche kind of stories that we may want to play. And I think there's also some things that are taboo in social role-playing game, like playing the lone wolf hero. That guy is not going to mesh with a group. So everybody's
Right.
discouraging people. Just, I guess we are all restricting ourselves when we play with people to playing a story in which a group could realistically be playing that. Whereas when you're just one hero or one or two, the kind of stories that you can play expands quite a lot. So I think that combination of what you just said, plus that restriction of that elimination of the taboos, allows ourselves to have a myriad of stories when solo role playing.
Right.
One thing that I've noticed is that the kind of stories is also the kind of stories that you can tell is also influenced by the rules that you are playing. If you take, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons, which everybody's familiar with, if you take just a magic user from like level 1 and you drop that poor person alone in an adventure, they are going to die horribly at the first monster they find.
Yes.
So, for instance, the typical story of dungeoneering wouldn't be possible just taking the rule set of basic Dungeons and Dragons plus Mythic, for instance. And that's something that Kevin Crawford, the guy that I said that I talked too much about, tried to solve with his rules for playing solo heroes with the Dungeons and Dragons rule set. So I don't know if that this goes into two questions. I don't know if this is something that you've thought about or noticed when you were playing. And if it is, do you usually make your characters stronger, or do you adapt the kind of stories that you play to just those limitations of being just one with the power level that entails?
Sure. Yeah, you have to adjust to it. I mean, it's a matter of scale. If you, okay, like we were talking about Tomb of Annihilation. That's the modern version of Tomb of Horrors. It's expecting that you're starting off with, like, I think 4 to 6 players, levels 4 to 6 or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So a pretty decently powerful group of characters. How do you send a single character into that in a solo play and expect them to get past the first couple of episodes, right? Mm-hmm. So with something like that, it is a matter of scale and it has to be recognized. What I usually do is I will scale the character up to meet the challenges, and I'll also kind of scale the challenges down a little bit. And for me, it's a simple matter of just coming up with kind of some kind of a fraction or something like I just cut every encounter in half, basically, either half the numbers for a group or half the hit points and damage for a single encounter, something like that. That's some kind of simple rule of thumb. But yeah, you have to approach it with some level of scaling because the game is designed for a certain scale, right? So you have to recognize that. I might also, though, the tone of the game itself might be adjusted. Like, maybe I do want to play a first level magic user going it alone in a city, and the game might, by its nature, be more social in nature. You know, it may not have much in the way of combat or challenges in that sense. So, in that way, you kind of sidestep the whole dilemma. But yeah, I consider it a scaling issue, and it's something I think you have to address at the outset. Otherwise, you find yourself playing the game and then editing as you go along, like, oh, my character's going to die now. And that's not fun, you know. In a solo game, it takes you out of the experience. So yeah, a little bit of preparation ahead of time, I think, is necessary.
Yeah, I think it's something that at first may be overlooked by someone who's just starting, because they are used to the power level and inherent mechanics and assumptions about the rule sets that they want to use. And then they face reality and two wolves destroy their poor character.
I almost never start with a first level character or a beginning character in my solo games. It's just, for one thing, I just find it not as fun. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, part of the character generation process is also a solo role-playing experience. Like say I'm making a D&D character, I'll make a first level character. And then I might take the adventure crafter and come up with, I'll have the adventure crafter basically generate this character's backstory. And it'll create a whole, series. Maybe this character's been adventuring for 10 years. I know now what she's accomplished, what quest she's been on. And I'll just calculate the experience as I figure this out. And before I know it, I've got a 6th level character with a complete background. done all that adventuring in 20 minutes, and in whammo, and then I can insert her into adventures, and it feels less like cheating when you do that. Like instead of just starting off with a 6th level character, you miss out on that development phase, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, solo playing through that rapidly kind of gives you that kind of background montage where you still get the same feeling.
Yeah, that's amazing. I usually start my games at level 1 and then suffer a lot. So I had never thought about leveling them up with the Adventure Crafter, but it's genius because indeed it helps you avoiding that like blank slate feeling of, well, who the F am I playing? Level 6, I don't know anything about them.
Yeah, and it is kind of just a practical matter too. Like if you were saying about how a level 1 character is just not going to do well.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that level 6 character is not going to be meeting the same challenges that they might, that a group of level 6 characters. That level 6 character might be meeting the challenges that a group of level 1 characters would be meeting. But the level 6 character can handle those challenges single-handedly. So,
indeed,
yeah.
I think I don't know where the diminishing returns point is, but for somebody who may be extremely enthusiastic about a specific rule set, like let's say 5th edition, it might be interesting also to invest in studying that power level. And for instance, in 5th edition, you've got bounded accuracy, and you're at a numeric well, not numeric, but mathematical disadvantage if you have the numeric disadvantage. If the enemies are more than you, the maths are playing against you.
Right.
So studying those kinds of things and trying to adapt those to like balance the power level may be worth it if somebody is really enthusiastic about replicating the experience that they would get with a group. But of course, that's completely outside Mythic.
I agree with you completely on that. Like if we were talking about pre-published adventures, and if you are going to adjust the scale, whether it's your character's level or the challenges you're going to meet, you really do have to understand the role-playing game you're playing really deeply, because it does get down into numbers, and there are probably there's no effective guides for this kind of thing, so you kind of have to figure it out yourself. But yeah, that would require a real good understanding of the game you're playing.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. This is also interesting. We've talked about starting conditions and how all of our tools, or most of our tools, usually help us with that. How much do you prepare your games in general? Do you start from let's start asking questions with yes or no? If that is in one axis or one point of the scale, and in the other it's playing a pre-made setting, for instance, and studying it in detail, where do you fall?
I like to, these days I like to play a kind of a sandbox approach to my games, and I will start from knowing nothing. And the very first thing I'll come up with is a character concept. And then, like I was saying about that character's background, develop that, and that helps me develop the character's world, and then that helps me populate like the characters lists with people and threads lists. And then when I start the game now, I've got basically a ready-made world that has grown up around the character I just created, and that's all I know. And then whatever the first scene is leads me into that character's adventure. So I kind of like starting with nothing, starting from scratch and seeing what develops.
Yeah, I think that possibly you take one of the best approaches, which is gamifying the creation of the background. Like doing it with the Adventure Crafter or similar tool helps with,
Mm-hmm.
instead of just thinking and writing, just generating it and getting a starting condition.
It's different from how I used to do it. I mean, I used to be more, I would start a game with kind of the game's concept in mind, like you would when you started a dungeon. Like I'm going to have a character who goes on a quest to find the magic ring to take it on the Dark Lord, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very specific adventure kind of thing. These days, like I said, I'm more kind of generating a world, plopping the character in that world, and then seeing what happens. Like I have no idea what quest is going to come up, or what goal is going to manifest, or if anything, I might not. She may just kind of do her own thing.
Which I think that in a way it may make it more comfortable to use with Mythic. Because I usually describe Mythic as I really mean no offense by this, cocaine-fueled horse that's running around everywhere. And if you're trying to steer it into one direction, it may be very hard. Mythic's not going to allow you to do that most of the time.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of that's like a mental thing, a mental hurdle to get over. That Mythic does ostensibly there is a Game Master Emulator to help you play your role-playing games, but if you stop to think about it a little bit, it's its own thing too, and you can kind of, I don't want to say like take it beyond standard role-playing. You can go off in a completely different direction than what we're used to, and this is again, I think, where the sandbox approach comes into it, where you just see what happens, see where it takes you. And I've had some of the most interesting stories develop from doing that, where I have absolutely no idea where it's going to go, and I just know the most basic facts of this character's world, and then it all kind of develops from there. And it's a very different experience from a classic role-playing experience.
I completely agree. In general, I usually say, and I really mean it, that Mythic is more original than I am as GM. Because the things that it throws at me, I would have never expected.
Me too. Me too. And when I play like this too, there's no end to it either. There's never, when you start off with no goal, there's like, these games only end for me when I stop playing them, and they just like I had this one character who ended up traveling through time against her will and going all over the place and trying to solve that. And every time she tried to solve it, it created problems, and it just went on forever. And it was awesome. But it was so different from a class experience because there was no set goal, no set objective. There's just this character kind of experiencing this world. And I really enjoy that a lot. And I think it's something people don't often think about.
Okay, so now we're also going to hit one of the things that I've thought about that sometimes it's not mentioned when doing random tables. If we go to the classical random tables that we find in, for instance, the original D&D or things like that, we find very specific random tables. 100 things to find in the right pocket of a zombie. And if we go to the other extreme, we've got, for instance, the meaning lists from Mythic, which are made to be used in almost any situation. All of them have a value, of course, but I feel that recently in Solo, we are seeing the emergence of what I called in the video that I did about this, the hybrid tables. Those that are generic, but they've still got a broad overview. And first of all, before we get into this, I want to congratulate you, because when I was reading the other day, Mythic Magazine Volume 2, I think the 3 tables for locations, encounters, and objects fall into that. And when I was reading them and copying them to my scripts, I was like, well, this solves so many things.
Right.
Is this something that you've also thought about, or does that mental framework fit your experience?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And I'm glad you mentioned Location Crafter and second magazine. Yeah, it was exactly that. Like, in fact, I ran into that as a problem because I'm making this randomized version of Location Crafter. I'm relying on meaning tables to generating a lot of these details, and it just was not satisfying because it was the meaning tables were too general for something this specific. And so what I ended up doing, and this was kind of interesting, was like I ended up, like you mentioned, there's 3 tables in there for location, encounters, and objects. And I just took the standard meaning tables and I copied over all the elements that apply to each category. Like some of the word choices in there work better than others for locations, encounters. And so I ended up stripping out everything like that didn't fit for a location or encounter, and then adding in more specific stuff, exactly as you say, that it's a hybrid, it's in the middle ground. And that I'm very happy with how that turned out. I think that's maybe the first time I've done that, and it's I'm thinking that I need to do more of that, because it basically just made a finer tuned meaning table, but the results are so much better.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's something that I said in the original video. But those tables are jewels. When I found those and good ones, because they basically solve portions of your solo role-playing games. Because a table that contains 20 extremely flavorful results for a specific situation is very nice. But if you run that 30 times, you're going to start repeating results. So it's not going to be that interesting. But a hybrid one is going to generate results that are always on point, and it's never going to be the same. So it's for me, those are perfect. And I'm so glad. I was so glad when I was reading the Mythic magazine.
Well, it's interesting that what we're talking about right now goes back to the second question you asked me today, and what we discussed about how the focus of solo game design these days is drilling down into specifics. And this is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, again, I ran into that as a problem, is when I was making this, it just wasn't satisfying. And then this hybrid, I came up with a hybrid table, and it was so much more satisfying. So I'd love to see more of that kind of thing. And it's endless. I mean, you could have more specific meaning tables or word choice tables for just about anything. And that would help solve a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was going to keep this for the last question, but I'm going to move it because it is related to this. Are you familiar / what's your opinion on Ironsworn?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I think it's amazing. It's a beautiful game, well constructed. The thing that stands out to me about it is that it has solo oracle built into the game, which I think is great. Frankly, it's something that I think every game should have eventually, that a solo section in a book should be right there alongside introduction, player creation, combat, test resolution, solo oracle. So for me, it's really gratifying, because I came up with Mythic back in 2003, and at the time, honestly, I didn't think anyone would be interested in it. It felt like it was so out there. I'm making a solo engine for a social game. It felt like a losing thing, a stupid thing to do, right? But I'd used it for myself for years, so I figured, I might as well put it out there. So here we are today, 17 years later. There's solo systems all over the place. You're seeing solo creep into kind of like not necessarily mainstream games, but it's becoming more and more common. And Ironsworn to me is like a very good example of how a solo system should be incorporated into a standard game. And it doesn't detract from, I mean, you take something like Mythic that can be applied to anything, or don't necessarily need a game to play it with. But I think every published game should have a solo section in it, specifically designed for that game.
Mm-hmm. I moved this question now to this moment because in Ironsworn, Sean, the author, includes a whole array of random tables, but right. I think that two of them are the best ones because they are hybrid tables. One of them is for combat actions, and it's like the meaning tables. It's a combination of two words. And then there's also another one for traps in dungeons. And I was very happy when I found those. And that's where I first started to identify the sweet spot of the hybrid. But also yesterday when I was writing the questions down, I was thinking, I think it's obvious for anybody who watches the channel, I'm really a Mythic player to the point where it is almost second nature for me now. And in fact, I've got everything scripted. So for me, playing with Mythic is just very fast because I'm writing commands on my console.
Right.
And I think that for me, the equivalent of Mythic, the differences between Mythic and Ironsworn in RPGs is the same as in Fate versus Powered by the Apocalypse in RPGs. Meaning, both Mythic and Fate, which are well, Mythic is my favorite solo tool, and Fate is one of my favorite RPGs. Both are sort of generic enough that you don't have to think if you want to apply them to anything, so you can start playing at any moment. Whereas Ironsworn and PBTA, which basically they are the same almost. Some people get angry when I say that Ironsworn is powered by the apocalypse. I don't know exactly why. Both are hyper-focused rule sets that are tailored specifically to give you an experience, and they do it very well. So I see. I understand the appeal of Ironsworn. It's a package, as any other PBTA game. It's a whole package that you just take this and you're able to live the experience that it wants to transmit, and it's going to do it extremely well.
Well, it's kind of like how when I first came out with Mythic, and then I realized that the concept of themes should be incorporated. And Mythic Creations 1 came out and with the change of focus tables and such. And it feels to me like other people have thought about that idea in a sense, and here we are years later where that idea has kind of evolved, and we're getting exactly what you're talking about, these systems that are tailored to offer a feeling, an atmosphere, a specific theme to the experience, which is really what we're talking about. Trying to guide the atmosphere of the experience without railroading it.
Honestly, for me, it is not a great shame, but it's a slight of a shame that people don't promote Mythic more, because once it is part of your nature, when solo role playing, it allows you to play anything. It's like when I was doing that equivalence with Fate. It's because if you have an idea or a concept or in any kind of setting you want to play in, pairing, for instance, in my case, Fate with Mythic, it allows you to start playing in 5 minutes. So I think it's one of those things that everybody should have in their toolbox, because it's so simple, easy to use, and generic enough that you can apply it to anything.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I agree. And I think one of the reasons why maybe you don't see that more is that it does require a certain mental saturation point where you've gotten so familiar with it, like you say. And it's not even really getting familiar with the crunchy rules aspects. It's more getting familiar with just
being guided.
Being guided, how it feels to do it. It's so different. And it is a little strange. Most people, when they first approach something like this, will never have had tried anything like it. And so they're going to try and guide it with their own past experiences. And they almost have to break away from that. And the only way to do that is by repeatedly experiencing it and using it. That takes time. But then once you get there, like you say, it's like, I agree. It's like I can pick up any game, pick up Mythic and be playing this right away. And I don't even need to know all the rules of the game. I'm in a place where I don't know a rule. I'll just Mythic will step in. And I don't know, it's just, I use the most simple aspects of Mythic too. So I rarely go beyond just the basic fate questions and such. So
now this may be a very short answer, or it may be very long. I hope it's on the longer part. Which, if any, resources do you use apart from Mythic to play solo? For instance, the Universal NPC Emulator by Conjecture Games, the Tome of Adventure Design, which is a huge collection of random tables. Anything like that?
I don't use anything else. That sounds awful, but I only use my own tools. But the thing is, though, that I started with Mythic making a system that I wanted to play, and basically everything that I make, even the stuff in the Mythic magazine, is all stuff that I want. It's like if I were looking for a product, what would I want? So I make it. So yeah, it's I hate to say, I only use my own solo tool.
It's all right. I mean, it's the short answer. I expected either very short or very long because,
Short.
yeah, a lot of solo role players in the Discord server, for instance, we are always exchanging random tables, resources, ways of doing things. But it makes sense. I mean, I'm extremely jealous that if you're able to identify one of your solo role playing needs, you're able to create a product to solve them instead of waiting for somebody to do it.
Yeah, and and also some of this is just flat out lack of time. Like a lot of people, we only have so much time, right? So, and I do spend a lot of my time making stuff, and so my play time is actually very limited. So a lot of my actual play gaming time ends up being play testing tools that I'm making, and so there's really not much time left outside of that to experiment with other stuff.
I see. Great. So let's hit the last question. I know that you've played pre-made adventures. We were talking about Tomb of Annihilation. What are your thoughts about using Mythic? I mean, without spoiling anything from the future Mythic magazines, but if we can get anything from your mind now on playing pre-made adventures with Mythic.
Right. Well, this is an interesting question. I always thought that solo role-playing was like the holy grail of role-playing, right? And to me, playing pre-published adventures is the holy grail of solo role-playing. If we're going to drill down a little further, there's a lot of good resources out there, and you've discussed it, and other people have discussed it, and there's great tools online and that people have developed for approaching this. There's so many ways to go about it. I think like when Mythic magazine comes out, my article on this comes out, I'm thinking some people might be a little disappointed because my approach to it is actually very simple.
Simple as good.
Yeah. I mean, there's some very good tools out there, like DM yourself and things like that, that are maybe going to go a little deeper. But my basic approach to it is just, just to play it, to go through it. You have to give up. You have to acknowledge. I mean, there's two factors here. It's like there's the surprise factor, and there's the intent of the adventure, and you can't have both. It's just something you have to accept. It's not going to play like a standard published adventure with a GM. You're not going to get the full experience. At the same time, you're not going to get the full solo experience, right? Because the adventure has its specifics. So you're losing out on both. But what you keep in both and you put together, you get a unique experience. And we were talking about how solo itself is a unique experience. I think there's a way to approach pre-published adventures with solo in a different way than what you might be used to. And for me, it's essentially it's pretty much what you would expect. I mean, I don't read ahead. I just play, read what I encounter. I accept the fact that I know more than my character knows, and that's okay. I have to play my character as if they don't know these things. Now, that does spoil some surprises, but I still get the experience of the adventure. I actually find that sandbox modules work better than linear ones because they do allow you more wiggle room, and Mythic can come up with more things. Like when I did Tomb of Annihilation, there's a big character in that who's an important aspect of the game that my character encountered. And Mythic had that character do something a little different than what the character was intended to do, and it worked out. So I do recognize that playing published adventures in a solo way is difficult. And I think the most difficult part of it is accepting that you're going to have to give up a little bit of the classic experience. But I actually enjoy it a lot. I don't think it's as it's not that difficult, but yeah, there are some concessions you have to make.
That's extremely great because no, it's great. Not only because indeed it sounds like what you're going to propose is simple, not easy. I mean, simple to use, but also because it's very different from the way that I tackle that, and I think it's also very different from how DM yourself does it. So it's very good that there are going to be different resources, and I think it speaks to how solo role playing is an overfitted experience, because everyone does it differently, because we all enjoy things differently. So it's amazing to see how the minds of every person that thinks about this ends up at the solution that satisfies them.
Yes, I don't think there's going to be a perfect answer to how to solo role play. Just like you said, everyone has different wants and expectations. A pre-published solo adventure is like so rich in detail and intent and material and resources. There's a lot of ways to approach it. So, although I said solo pre-published adventures is kind of a holy grail, I don't think there's going to be a single response to that. I think there's going to be a whole range of responses to that. And like you say, I want to see more. I think we've only started to touch the tip of the iceberg on this, and I'm going to admit that my approach to it probably isn't the best approach. There are other people who have thought about this more deeply. It's just my approach. Mm-hmm. But honestly, I just looking at, I like your approach, and DM yourself. Your idea, honestly, I think your ideas are brilliant on it. And it's just, I like the fact that these options are developing, because it will give players, when they get exposure to these, they will gravitate to the approach that works best for them. I want to see more of it. I feel like we're only starting to get into this now, and there's so much material with pre-published adventures, and I think they can marry very well with solo roles, and we just need to come up with that bridge.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also a different experience from playing solo, and it may be in a way an easier one, in the sense that it lightens your mental workload. Instead of putting yourself in a blank space and constantly expanding it, this is going to happen, but then Mythic is going to play around and keep surprising you. So I think it may be a lighter way of playing sometimes when we are too overburdened, because it's something that I feel sometimes I really want to play, but it requires, it's almost like GMing. It's going to require a lot of mental capacity to do it. And maybe doing that with a pre-made adventure, I haven't played with pre-made adventures that much, but I think it may help being a lighter experience in solo role playing.
Yeah, like for me, when I do it, scenes are a lot less of a factor. You almost don't have scenes at all. Mythic is more adjudicating what happens in the adventure, and the character reactions and things like that. So, like in Tomb of Annihilation, my character ended up getting in a fight with a giant alligator in the river, right? Trying to topple her boat over. And so I had to use Mythic to decide how is the crocodile going to attack? Is it going to bite? Is it going to try to flip her boat? When she goes ashore, is it going to chase her? That kind of thing. That's the solo rules are more useful than, you don't really need the scene structure, because the adventure itself is already providing it. Random events will generate the kind of surprises for you, more so than interrupt scenes would. So it's a little bit different approach.
Yeah, I agree completely on that. Indeed, the scene structure of Mythic doesn't always fit with the different stories. For instance, one that I think that I usually break out of the scene framework is when I'm doing wilderness travels in classical D&D. There, I usually break it down in days. But then those days can be scenes, because I also make the scene interruption or alteration for days. So it's kind of similar, but you're right on that. Indeed, that adventure, pre-made adventures also can, not break the framework, but make it different.
Yeah, you think about it. The scenes in Mythic are what gives the story the structure. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of the scaffolding of it. But a pre-published adventure already has that structure, mm-hmm. And so you barely need the scenes at all.
Indeed. Okay, so let's finish with something light and funny and entertaining. I'm not going to even constrain the emotion. Just some people were asking for any kind of anecdote of your games, whatever, anything that you remember dearly or that really shook you or that was emotional, whatever you prefer.
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, like from one of my adventures.
Yeah, something like, oh well, when this happened, moon fell down from the sky and it was amazing because Mythic decided to destroy everything.
I'm going to go back to that adventure that I mentioned earlier. I was planning on doing a typical superhero adventure, modern day, pretty middle of the road powers, just fighting crime. You know, I was just in the mood for something very simple. And somehow or other, she ended up encountering this villain who opened a portal in dimensions. She got sucked through and thrown back in time like 20 years. And suddenly this turned into a really complicated story and it wasn't even that far back. I mean, 20 years was recent enough in history where her former self is still in the world. And this completely changed the direction of my game, turned it into a much more personal story. And it was just very strange where it was like I went from wanting to do this kind of gritty street level beating up criminals just because I was in a simple mood into something that Mythic wanted to play a story that had more depth to it. It ended up becoming the story about this character's history and her background and addressing her regrets and the chance to redo things and the implications of what happens when you try to change your life. And totally unexpected, one of the most memorable role-playing experiences I ever had. So
That's amazing.
This to me is it's the best of what Mythic offers. And I mean that could happen in a social experience too. You could sit down with a game master and they might have an idea they've been thinking about for a long time and they spring in on you and like, oh my God, that was amazing. Mythic does that, and yeah, so that's one of those adventures I'm going to be thinking about for years.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing that I haven't mentioned is the usefulness of Mythic as a co-GM for normal games. As I said, I have it on my computer, so when I'm playing that 4-year campaign that I told you about, I always have them open, like the scripts. So it's almost like a lazy approach, but it works very well because I create the scaffolding of the world, and then the nitty-gritty, the details, I don't decide, the Mythic does, and then I just run with that.
Right.
It gives you an improvisational muscle that is amazing.
It is, yeah. It's the same solo experience, but it's the co-GM. I'll do that when I'm playing online, like play-by-post kind of games, and I GM. And it makes it so much easier. You just have Mythic doing it.
Indeed. Well, Tana, this has been honestly one of the best experiences I've had in the whole channel. It's been amazing discussing Mythic and all of the nitty-gritty details of solo role playing with you. I know that I said it at the start, but you're probably one of the geniuses of the hobby. So I really feel honored for this.
Well, thank you. That's high praise. I don't know if it's deserving, but I really appreciate it. And I enjoyed this interview a lot.
I hope we can talk again in the future, but in the meanwhile, we'll stay in touch at the Discord server. And for any kind of viewer, you can also get in touch with us and with Tana, on Twitter, on the Discord server, on the Yahoo group or mailing list. I don't know if that's still going. I know it changed to another group.
Yeah, groups.io done.
Exactly. And especially through your Patreon, where people can get highlights of your production development diaries and the early copies of the Mythic magazine, which I wholeheartedly recommend. They are amazing. Great. Well, have a nice day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.